213 ships, chained together, hull against hull, across the mouth of a Flemish estuary, a floating fortress so vast that men who saw it said the masts looked like a forest rising out of the sea. This was the pride of France, the fleet that had burned England's ports, captured her greatest ships, and taught her coastal towns to fear the horizon. Its commanders believed that nothing on earth could break it, and by sunset on the 24th of June, 1340, almost all of it would be gone. Somewhere between 16 and 20,000 Frenchmen would be dead, most of them drowned in armor, dragged down into the grey water of the North Sea. So many bodies drifted on the tide in the days that followed that a bitter joke began to spread across Europe. If the fish off the coast of Flanders could speak, they would speak French. This is the story of the Battle of Sluys, the first great naval victory in English history, and the day France learned what it would cost to challenge England upon the sea. To understand the shock of Sluys, you must first understand the humiliation that came before it. In 1337, King Edward III of England had pressed his claim to the crown of France, and the long struggle that history would call the 100 Years' War had begun. But in those first years, it was not England that ruled the waves, it was France. King Philip VI had assembled a formidable naval force, stiffened by hired Genoese galleys, fast, professional, predatory, and he unleashed them against the English coast. In 1338, French raiders fell upon Portsmouth and burned it. Then they came for Southampton, one of the wealthiest ports in the kingdom, and left it a smoking ruin. Hastings burned, fishing villages burned, and worst of all, the French captured two of the finest ships England possessed. The great cog Christopher, pride of the king's own fleet, was taken and turned against her former masters. All along the southern coast of England, church bells rang warnings in the night, and families slept with their belongings packed, ready to flee inland. There was open talk in Paris of a full invasion of French soldiers marching on London itself. England, the island nation, was losing the sea. By the summer of 1340, Philip of France decided to end the matter. Edward had built his war strategy on an alliance with the towns of Flanders, the great weaving cities of Bruges and Ghent, that depended on English wool and had defied their French overlords to stand with him. If Edward could not reach Flanders, his alliance would wither and his war would collapse before it began. So Philip gathered the largest fleet France had ever assembled, around 213 vessels, carrying tens of thousands of sailors, crossbowmen and men-at-arms, and anchored it in the estuary of the Zwin, before the port town of Sluys, the gateway to Bruges. It was a cork in a bottle. As long as that fleet held its station, the King of England could not set foot on the continent, except as a corpse or a prisoner. When Edward's own council learned of the size of the French armada, they begged him not to sail. His chancellor warned him, to his face, that the crossing was death. Edward's answer has echoed down the centuries in its cold simplicity. He declared that he would cross regardless, and that those who were afraid could stay at home. On the 22nd of June, the king put to sea with every ship England could muster, perhaps 120 to 150 sail, and set course for Flanders. Waiting for him were two men whose names France would spend the next 600 years trying to forget. Hugues Quiéret was an admiral and a knight. Naval Béhuchet was an accountant, a former royal treasurer, a lawyer by training, a man who had earned command not through war but through administration, and it was Béhuchet's caution that shaped the French plan. Alongside them stood a genuine professional, Pietro Barbavera, commander of the Genoese war galleys, a man who had spent his entire life fighting at sea. Barbavera looked at the anchorage, looked at the wind, and gave his employers the best advice they would ever receive. Put to sea, he told them. Take the open water. Use your numbers. Keep the fleet moving. A fleet at anchor in a narrow estuary, he warned, was not a fortress, it was a trap. The French commanders overruled him. Instead, they ordered their ships lashed together with chains and ropes, bow to stern, in 3 great lines across the estuary, a wall of timber bristling with men, designed to be unbreakable. It was a decision made by men who thought like soldiers defending a castle, not sailors fighting the sea. They had, with their own hands, chained their fleet in place, and in doing so, they had surrendered the wind, the tide, and every ounce of initiative to the King of England. Edward arrived off the Flemish coast on the 23rd of June and saw the forest of masts filling the mouth of the Zwin. He did not attack. Instead, for the better part of a day, the English fleet stood off, waiting, watching, and here the difference between the two commands became fatal. The French thought the delay was hesitation, perhaps even fear, and some believed the English were turning away. But Edward was reading the water. He was waiting for the early afternoon when the tide would turn and flood into the estuary, carrying his ships forward, when the wind would sit at his back, and when the summer sun would swing behind him, blazing directly into the eyes of the French crossbowmen. When all 3 aligned on the afternoon of the 24th of June, the feast day of St. John the Baptist, the English fleet came on under full sail, with the sun, the wind, and the sea itself fighting for England, and Edward brought with him a weapon the French still did not truly understand. His fleet advanced in coordinated groups of 3, 2 ships packed with longbowmen, flanking every ship of men-at-arms. The English warbow was a weapon unlike anything else in Europe, a 6-foot stave of yew that could loose 10, even 12 arrows in the time a Genoese crossbowman could manage 2 or 3 bolts. As the fleets closed, the sky itself seemed to change. Chroniclers wrote of arrows falling like hail, like winter sleet, so dense that they darkened the air above the water. The Genoese and French crossbowmen, staring into the afternoon sun, shooting slower, standing on crowded and immobile decks, began to die by the hundred before the ships even touched. This was the terrible arithmetic of the longbow, the same arithmetic that would slaughter French chivalry at Crécy 6 years later, and at Sluys, France received the first lesson written in its own blood. Then the hulls struck, grappling irons flew, and the battle became something no sailor of the Mediterranean would have recognized. It became a land battle, fought on floating platforms of wood, a medieval siege at sea. English men-at-arms poured over the gunwales into the chained French lines, hacking their way from deck to deck, while the archers above swept every open space with arrows. And because the French ships were bound together, they could not maneuver, could not support one another, could not retreat. Each vessel simply waited its turn to be boarded and emptied. The fighting was savage beyond description, axe and sword and dagger in spaces so packed that the dead could not fall. One by one, the great ships of the first French line were taken, including a prize that made English crews roar in triumph. The Christopher, the stolen pride of Edward's fleet, recaptured and turned back upon her captors within the hour. As the afternoon wore into evening, the men of Flanders came swarming out from the shore in their own boats, striking the French line from behind. The trap Barbavera had predicted was now complete, and it had teeth on every side. What followed was not defeat, it was annihilation. Frenchmen who leapt from their burning ships drowned in their armor, or were speared in the water, or reached the Flemish shore only to be killed by the very peasants whose land their king had claimed. The estuary turned red. Contemporary accounts speak of the sea so thick with corpses that the tide could barely move them. Admiral Hugues Quiré fought on his flagship until he was cut down, dying of his wounds amid the wreck of his command. And Nicolas Béhuchet, the treasurer, the accountant, the man who had chained the fleet, was taken alive. For a nobleman, capture usually meant ransom and comfortable imprisonment, not for Béhuchet. Edward's men knew exactly who he was, the commander behind the burning of Southampton, the man whose raiders had slaughtered English townsfolk in their homes. Before the battle had even fully ended, Béhuchet was hanged from the mast of Edward's own flagship, his body left swinging above the water, silhouetted against the burning fleet, where every Frenchman still fighting could see it. It was justice, vengeance, and a message, delivered in a single stroke of rope. This is what happens to men who burn English towns. When the Genoese professional Barbavera saw it, he did what professionals do. He cut his galleys free and escaped to sea, taking with him virtually the only French vessels to survive the day. Of that vast armada of 213 ships, England captured or destroyed around 190. The scale of the catastrophe was so immense that it broke something in the French court. For days, no one, not a minister, not a marshal, not a prince of the blood, could summon the courage to tell King Philip what had happened to his fleet. In the end, so the famous story goes, the task fell to the court jester, the only man in France permitted to speak disaster to the king. The fool approached the throne and declared that English sailors were nothing but miserable cowards. When Philip asked why, the jester delivered the line that has survived 7 centuries, "Because the English, sire, do not dare to jump into the sea in their armor, the way our brave Frenchmen do." That is how the King of France learned that his navy had ceased to exist, from the mouth of his own fool, in a joke about 20,000 drowned men. It is perhaps the most devastating punchline in the history of warfare, and it tells you everything about the terror that now surrounded England's name at sea. The consequences of that single June afternoon would shape a century. At a stroke, the threat of a French invasion of England evaporated. The barges, the raiders, the burning ports, all of it ended. The English Channel became, and would in large measure remain, an English sea. Edward could now land armies on the continent at will, and he did. Crécy, Calais, Poitiers, the great land victories of the age were all made possible because Sluys had thrown open the door. From 1340 onward, the 100 Years' War would be fought almost entirely on French soil. French towns would burn instead of English ones, and French kings would learn to fear the horizon just as English villagers once had. And something deeper had been born in the estuary of the Zwin, an idea that would outlive every man who fought there, that England's true wall was not made of stone, but of ships, and that her survival and her greatness would forever be written on salt water. The line that runs from Drake at Cadiz to Nelson at Trafalgar to the grey destroyers of Dunkirk begins here, in the blood-dark water of Sluys, on the day the fish learned to speak French. Because the sea remembers its masters, and in June of 1340, the sea chose England.